Okay, thank you. Katie, you were right. I am before you. Okay. I'm Brett Hauber from RTI Health Solutions. I guess this is my clicker. So I decided not, based on a phone call that we had with Mark and Morgan and others, a week and a half ago, I decided not to do a case study of my own, but instead to promote my current thinking on the topic, which we were told we were allowed to do. So I'm going to take that liberty and do that. So I want to start out by saying there is a working definition, a set of working definitions of what patient preference methods are. This is a relatively recent phenomenon, and Matt's indicated that there are lots of different methods out there, lots of different people who do different things. Nobody agrees with one another. There are lots of different camps. But there is a method, a definition that is out there that people tend to refer back to. And this is the definition that's in the CDRH guidance for patient preference information. As Matt's also alluded to, there are lots of methods out there, and most people who do these methods come from different disciplines, work in different buildings, and don't talk to one another. So the MDIC, Medical Device Innovation Consortium, did a framework for benefit risk analysis for medical technologies 2, maybe 3 years ago now. And as part of that, there was a catalog of methods, and in that catalog of methods, there was this organization scheme that's kind of on the left-hand side. I Prefer found more types of patient preference methods and has a different type of categorization scheme. But we're beginning to put some framework around how to think about the different types of patient preference methods. If you go into PubMed and put preference in, you will get hundreds of thousands of papers. If you take out genetic preferences and all of the scientific maybe hard science areas where you talk about gene expression preferences and those types of things, you're still left with hundreds of thousands. And when you start looking at patient preferences in particular, you might get below 100,000. So the point is there's a lot of stuff going on here. Everybody is using the word patient preference. People often have a different interpretation of what exactly that means, but interestingly, they're all kind of getting at the same concept. So these efforts that have been going on and continue to go on to kind of organize this is a work in progress, but this is real progress compared to where we were just a few years ago. I want to highlight 2 recent examples of how patient preferences have been used in somewhat high-profile cases to kind of get to my point of where I think we need to go. And both of these are regulatory examples. So these are after pivotal studies, end of phase 3 type work, which is a point in and of itself. A lot of the action recently has been at that point of regulatory approval. So there's an absence of stuff before then. Maybe that's the point there. But this happens to be a study that FDA sponsored. They developed a stated preference study to look at benefit risk trade-offs among different attributes associated with medical devices for obesity, for weight loss. And they developed this study. You'll see that little box there on the right is actually a tool that came out of that study that's presented in the paper on this study. And they used the tool when reviewing a device. So the design, this is a generalizable thing. They used this when they were reviewing the Maestro device, and FDA took the information that they learned from evaluating the Maestro device to the panel and presented that as evidence for the need for this device. So that was a big deal. That got a lot of press and all of a sudden put patient preferences on the map for a whole bunch of people who didn't think it was important. More recently, and just as impactful, was there was a study sponsored by Genentech looking at preferences for subcutaneous versus IV Rituxan in blood cancers. This was a crossover study. So this was an interventional study that was done using a crossover design. And at the end, after people had been exposed to both modes of administration, they were asked, which one do you like better? Pretty simple question. There's more to it than that, but that's the general idea. And this became part of the patient experience section of the label. So these are two very different examples. They're both patient preferences, but they both use different methods. They were both used for different purposes. The obesity study was sponsored by FDA. The Rituxan study was funded by an industry sponsor. In the FDA study, we use a discrete choice experiment, which is hypothetical scenarios using an underlying experimental design. In the case of the rituximab study, we're looking at actual exposure and then ask people what they think they should do. One looks at things at the attribute level, kind of like what John was talking about, that distinction between that and an actual choice. And then one could be applied to multiple decisions, one could be applied to a single decision. So those are two very different examples, both considered patient preferences. But what that demonstrates to me is there's a lot of stuff out there that can be done. There's not a common language or even common agreement, as Matt said. So what I think this all tells us is there are people kind of working on organizing this stuff. So for me, it raises the question, do we have hammers out there where we're just looking for nails, saying, I've got a method to elicit patient preferences and I'm going to give this to you? What I would prefer that we do instead is step back and say, what are the needs of decision makers, whether those decision makers are regulators, HTA bodies, patients themselves, physicians, guideline writers, whatever it may be. What are those needs? What decisions do they make? What are the information needs? What's the appropriate method for a given situation? I think we're pretty far from getting to that point yet, but we are on the road. And then finally, when the end user gets this information, how do they evaluate what they have? I mean, this is where I think we need to step back and look at the broader landscape when we talk about patient preferences and say, what are the needs? And how can patient preferences and patient preference information begin to fulfill those needs? A little bit over.
Oh, but you were very close. It was great. Wonderful job. And right on point for inspiring us to think about the methods around patient preferences and the science of patient preferences. And importantly here, who's going to use it for what, right? Because that's going to be different methods are appropriate in different places. This isn't a winner-take-all kind of approach, is my sense, right?
Yep.
Questions or comments? Anthony?
That was fantastic.
And
I just
please
wanted
identify yourself.
Anthony Yanni Sanofi. That last point I think is critically important. It's been on my mind since we've been discussing this, is this idea that in each phase of development, there's different needs, different methods that may satisfy those needs, and then ultimately, how do we make the information actionable?
Yes.
How do we take the information, which a lot of people are doing, but then apply it to how we develop drugs that satisfy particular needs or patients or subpopulations? So I think that's a really important point.
Okay, great. Thank you. You said it better than I did. Thanks.
Wonderfully done. Any other comments? Here in front, please. Andrea.
I too thought that was excellent. I think.
Andrea, please
Andrea Ferris from Longevity again. I think a very important point of this, part of this too, is not only asking the right question, but who are the right people to do the work? Because if you're trying to collect, a body of resources, evidence, and all that, there are certain people who do the work really well, and then there are others who perhaps don't, and I think we just need to be very careful of that.
Well said. Kevin.
So I'm going to speak from personal experience. I facilitated a workshop that was on this with perfusion devices between patients and the FDA. It was excellent. I mean, from two perspectives. One is understanding the FDA's perspective, where they're getting submissions that have not captured the patient voice, nor they had a good value proposition. And then I think, too, it was helpful for the FDA to hear the patient risk that many patients are willing to take where they see the benefit. So I think more of these things that could be done in public forums are good for all parties, and to understand everyone's perspective.
Well said. And then we'll be trying to think in your breakout sessions and tabletop, how do we take these principles and scale them up into a research agenda that's more than just individual studies, which these are great examples, but how do we really propel the field forward? That's our goal. Brett, great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.